We are at the point where we are going to bottle up some beer. This is quite well fermented, I believe, but since I'm holding on to sanitized stuff here, I'm just going to put it into a sanitized container, and we're going to get a quick check on this. There's a huge temptation in every brewer once in a while to completely skip this step and say, it fermented for a week or fermented for 2 weeks. It's done. We don't know for sure exactly what may or may not be happening in here, and without taking a gravity reading, we might just find a bottle blowing up in our future. So we'll take a quick gravity reading here. Now this runs it out to about 10-12. That's certainly within the realm of what we're looking for. If anything, it might be a little bit lower than what we expect, but that's okay. That means the sugars are spent, and we can get into this and add the right amount of sugar to properly carbonate. That's the real danger if we don't do this. We can end up with a beer that has sugars from the ferment that didn't quite go all the way, and then we add extra sugar in. We end up with just an abundance of sugar in each bottle, which means the pressure that it will build will absolutely send these things flying to pieces. It's a royal mess to clean up, so I don't recommend just winging it. Not to mention the beer you lose. This particular beer has a British ale yeast strain that's very flocculent. That means the yeast sticks together very well, and as a result of that, as I let the siphon down to the bottom, it didn't pull up much of anything. That means really there's not much yeast floating around in here. Should be some, and it should be enough to get everything to carbonate completely perfectly. Here I've got corn sugar. Now, a lot of purists out there will always boil their corn sugar, and there's some good sense to that, because if you have some sediment or some dirt or something that got into your corn sugar, heck, even from the scoop, maybe it's not completely sterile. The corn sugar itself can be treated as pretty sterile. It doesn't really have anything that, well, anything likes to live on its own. So, I've got a little over half a gallon of beer already siphoned in, and I'm just going to dump it right in. I know somebody out there someplace is cringing that I did not boil this. I'm up to about 50 batches bottled this way with not one issue, so maybe I'm just getting lucky. But if you do want to be a purist, certainly you can boil the stuff. Right now I'm just jostling the siphon hose a little bit to try and help the sugar dissolve. I'm rather particular about this because we don't want to get much oxygen involved at this time. The more oxygen that actually comes into the bucket at this point means, well, that's the more likely is that the sugar is going to turn to alcohol, not just carbon dioxide. We really want just pretty much pure carbon dioxide ferment. If we really aerated this beer significantly at this stage, we'd end up with a kind of a boozy smelling and boozy tasting, slightly flat beer in the bottle. Really don't want to go there. So I'm going to keep the siphon hose at the bottom. That's pretty well dissolved in. Really wasn't any kind of excessive stirring in there. It was just pretty simple. And from here, we're just going to let this finish racking over, give it just a moment, and get the bottles going. Looks like I got about an even 5 gallons, which is pretty excellent because that's about the amount of primary sugar I gave it. In case anybody's taking notes, it's specifically 1 ounce of corn sugar per every gallon. That ends up working out to being 3/4 of a cup for 5 ounces, but if you're off by half a gallon for some reason or another, you can use a scale from there. So, this looks like it's pretty well set. I'm going to just hook up a bottling wand with some hose. So, absolutely everything here completely sanitized. Got these bottles here. Just going to give one more quick rinse with Star San. A little bit of foam in there, does not matter. Open up. It's not going to flow real much until we get the bottling wand depressed. Star San's going to jump out on us. And we are once again looking to fill this completely up to the top. And I mean the beer should be up to the top, not the Star San, so. That looks good. Just going to give this cap a little bit of Star San. Won't make much difference. Let's stick it on here for a moment. Go to crimp that up in a few moments here. But if you were doing a whole number of bottles, you might want to use a configuration like this, a bottle tree, where you can sanitize all your bottles ahead of time, put them up on the rack, and as you pull it off, fill it up, you can just keep working off of there instead of, well, making a bit of a mess trying to sanitize as you go. But for our purposes, this works just fine right now. Now the amount of sugar does not matter to the volume of the bottle. So here we are doing a 22 ouncer. Got a flip top. A lot of people like using Grolsch bottles. I've got one here. It works perfectly fine, but there's a few quick caveats I'm going to explain as I get to that. That's one wonderful thing about Star San. It just gets pushed right off and out. Right about now, I probably should be wearing gloves. If you have sensitive skin, definitely wear gloves if you're going to play with Star San like this. Alright. So, Grolsch bottle. Don't want to be hasty about clamping these down. You really want to make sure it's uneven, not too skewed to the side. Even a little bit like this or that can cause an improper seal. So direct up and down, clamp it off. That's all set to go. Bottles that we're capping, this is a very, very simple tool to use. There's a number of machines on the market that will do other caps, other size caps, other ways of capping, whether you have a lever that you throw or, oh goodness, I think I've seen a punch cap where you tap it with a mallet. I would never use something like that. That's a great way to send some broken glass into your arm. But the single lever ones are fantastic up to the point that you have to adjust the height on the bottles. So I've got 2 different size bottles here. And that's it. Pretty easy to use. Now with the rest of this beer, this keg's already been completely sanitized out. I've just got a little bit of extra fluid from the Star San. valve off. I'm just going to drain the rest of this out. At least enough. There we are. So we can safely take that off. Once a keg is sanitized, it's pretty easy to fill. A batch like this is going to give us about 52, 53 bottles. Technically, if we got every last drop, we'd get 53 bottles. That takes a bit of time. It's pretty simple, as you see, but kegs are just wonderful. There is priming sugar in this solution, so we are going to naturally carbonate this keg. That's really not an issue. The main thing is, if you're going about that, you want to make sure you pull on the relief valve for just a moment, certainly within a day, and I usually would recommend it every few days thereafter. Otherwise you may end up with an overcarbonated beer. Keg does not require the same amount of carbonation sugars as the bottles do. That has to do with the volume of headspace in the keg versus the volume of the beer. But suffice to say, this is going to naturally carbonate. It's going to take probably about the same amount of time, maybe a little less. And then it's going to be a little bit overcarbonated because of the amount of sugar we put in here. So there's a couple of easy tricks, mainly smacking the keg right on the floor and pulling the relief valve. That'll dislodge some of the extra CO2. And then this keg will be ready to put into a fridge and dispense whenever we get around to it in the next 6 months. It won't require anything else. Normally when kegging with forced carbonation, it would require that you get that into a cold space pretty quickly and start putting gas on it. So this is kind of the easy way, especially if you have a fridge that only handles a couple of kegs. If you do this with maybe 6 or 7 kegs, you'd always have one in backup. I highly recommend that. We're just going to make sure we get the very last of this beer out. A little bit of oxygen won't kill it. In fact, most people when they're doing a forced carbonation are going to purge the keg of any oxygen first and with the CO2. In our case, there's going to be a little bit of oxygen inside there, a little bit of headspace inside there. Not a big deal. I would justify this by saying, hey, it's a British style. A little bit of oxygen is just fine, but it's not just that. It's the fact that in about a day, there's going to be enough carbonation to blow the rest of it out anyway, so we're really only going to have the effects for about a day. Against this volume, that's not going to change much. It's obviously been completely star sand. These lids are infamously difficult to work with. So one of the first things we want to do is double check that it's actually seated properly. The way to do that is lift it. Nothing's dripping. We're good. Already you're going to get a little bit of something on it. So that's that. This keg is all set to go. We're just going to let it go for about a day. Pull this relief valve, and maybe once or twice over the next couple of weeks if we pull the relief valve a couple more times. It's going to help it kind of get the right level of carbonation. As I said before, this will be a little bit higher because we have a little more sugar than we need in this one. For a full keg, I would generally use about 1/3 of a cup, and that even still slightly overcarbonates it, but that's a much easier one to deal with. In any case, this will be good to drink in about 2 or 3 weeks once it's chilled down and we get rid of the extra gas. So that's it, start to finish.